Django Unchained presents a problematic representation of what actually occurred in the South during slavery. While American history classes often fail to capture the true injustices of slavery, Django Unchained appears to do much of the same. The film heralds the story of Django, a freed slave turned gunslinger who is on a mission to rescue his enslaved wife, Brumhilda, from Candyland, one of the most brutal plantations in the South. In many ways, Django, as a character, diverges from many of the negative tropes black people are forced to endure on screen. For one, Django is made to seem more intelligent than many of the southern hillbillies he encounters. Nonetheless, Django presents some issues in relation to how fair it is to represent slavery in southern life in this manner. One of the most pressing issues is that while the film is entertaining and in some ways empowering to African Americans, it fails to give America's actual history. The fictionalization present in this film is where questions about representation arise. Tarantino fails to capture the true brutality of slavery and, to a large extent, makes it seem like Django himself is an enigma. This is not true. During slavery, white slavers were constantly wary of rebellion, especially because they were outnumbered by blacks by a significant amount. On top of this, slave rebellion was more common than people believe. While Django himself is an awesome hero to have on screen, much of the progress he makes is undone by the presence of other poorly represented black people in the movie, specifically Steven. On one hand, you have Django, a black man who is clearly incredibly smart and talented and, most importantly, retains aspects of his identity that align with his black culture. Specifically, Django speaks African American vernacular English. Traditionally, the use of AAVE is used to create irony in films, or is used for comedic purposes. Django is one of the first characters to speak AAVE and still be a hell of a lot smarter than his white opponent.
I like the way you die, boy.
Steven, on the other hand, also speaks in AAVE, but has literally chosen to abandon his fellow slaves and pledge allegiance to Mr. Candy, his slave master. When looking at Steven in this situation, he is taking on a role that seemingly mocks African Americans and makes them seem subordinate, compliant, and just plain stupid. Due to the inclusion of Steven, the true power of Django's character is diminished.
Most people know how much black women were objectified during American slavery, but there are lesser-known realities of black womanhood in the West that have flown over our heads. Django Unchained was released in 2012, but in the 2010s, it was a decade of the rise of feminism, especially the #MeToo movement. So there were high expectations of this film in terms of its depiction of black women. That being said, the film's main female, Brumhilda, is your typical damsel in distress. She's a victim of Candy's brutality, and she needs another man to save her. Because of her blackness during the time of American slavery, she is especially a victim of reification and of commodification. She is bought and sold and separated from her family, and she has no agency. Besides Brumhilda being the main woman behind Django's motivations, there are hardly any other leading women in this film. Where are they? This lack of female presence perpetuates how the traditional Western genre always seems to be about the male character discovering and testing his masculinity against the challenge of the West. It is important to note that, while many of us may have not been aware of the black female presence in the Wild West, there are definitely black women who stood strong during these times. Examples include Bridget Biddy Mason and Mary Fields, otherwise known as Stagecoach Mary. These women had agency, and they were able to buy their freedom to sustain the business ventures that they sought out to achieve. No one would dare walk all over them, especially Stagecoach Mary, who stood at 6 foot tall and carried a shotgun. And yet, Django Unchained's depiction of black women is antithetical to the progress that black women have made throughout American history. What gives?
The Harder They Fall is a refreshing take on the Western, one that updates its portrayal of black characters. Moreover, it prominently features two strong female characters, Mary, played by Zazie Beetz, and Trudy, played by Regina King.
I prefer treacherous Trudy myself, but I'll take it.
Unlike previous Westerns, where women just manage the homestead or serve as objects to be rescued, the women in The Harder They Fall are major drivers in the film's plot. From their first appearance on screen, the women are depicted in positions of power. Mary is first heard before she is seen. The thud of her rifle hitting the ground foreshadows the vigor of her character, who backs down to no one. She, as well as Trudy, are both saloon owners, who take pride in the careers they've built for themselves.
I made things. I've built things.
And I ain't gonna risk all that just because you decide to come trotting back.
Throughout the movie, Mary takes initiative to do things for herself, rather than being told what she can and can't do.
Rufus need money, and I'm gonna make him off on Trudy Smith's place.
Mary, what in my character makes you think I'd allow that?
Not asking for your permission.
However, it doesn't always work out for Mary. Despite Nat trying to convince her otherwise, she heads into town to talk with Rufus. Her encounter with Rufus goes south, and she is made to look like a fool.
You walking into my town with that proposal. It's risky. What are you thinking?
Mary is then taken into captivity and ultimately requires saving from Nat, a male character.
You here for your damsel in distress?
Additionally, her character seems to lack personality in comparison to Trudy, and is written in much less detail than many of the male characters. Our introduction to Trudy is more powerful. From a low angle, we see Trudy pull her horse onto the tracks directly in front of an oncoming train. Her dark clothes contrast with the sky behind her, painting her as a powerful force within the landscape. Trudy remains steadfast on the tracks, commanding the train to halt before her. The frame splits right down the middle with Trudy on one side and the train on the other, portraying them as equal forces. Trudy, too, takes an aggressive role when it comes to their business deals.
You and your men wiped out an entire town, women and children included, to steal silver. Now that's some unscrupulous shit.
Often being the one to give orders rather than take them. In addition to the two female leads, a masculine-presenting woman also plays a key role in the movie. Cuffy is a sort of secret weapon, embodying more skill than most men in the movie, to a point where most people don't even know she isn't a man. She ultimately kills the fastest gunman in the West, proving her rightful place amongst the men.
Throughout the film, the female characters, Mary, Trudy, and Cuffy, are given a significant amount of autonomy. Their physical abilities are equal to that of the male characters, such as Rufus, Black, and Nat Love. With that being said, there are many instances throughout the film in which they still fall into the traditional female roles and stereotypes. For example, when Nat arrives in Douglastown and enters Mary's saloon.
What'd they call you?
They call me Cuffy.
So here, Cuffy had to prove her fighting skills to earn Nat's respect, and to even get him to ask her name. We see this again when Trudy helps button Rufus's sleeve.
You loyal to me?
The look on her face, when paired with this gesture, show that Rufus, a man, still has authority and greater autonomy over Trudy. However, there are some aspects of the story that are not historically accurate. For example, the real stagecoach Mary was darker and heavier than she was in The Harder They Fall. This can be problematic in that it plays into the trends of colorism and fat phobia. A Daily Tar Heel article sums this up perfectly. Changing stagecoach Mary's skin tone and body type to conform to white beauty standards says a lot, especially given that Mary is the love interest of the protagonist. There are numerous actresses with similar phenotypic characteristics that would have executed the role just as well. Despite these things, The Harder They Fall represents Black people in a better light than previous Westerns, showing their power and determination. Furthermore, it reconstructs Western women as powerful leaders rather than victims in side quests.